Здравствуйте, everyone, and welcome to episode 8 of History with a Drywaller. Today we are going to pick up where we left off last week with the whimsical story of Joseph Stalin. Specifically, we are going to start with the first 5-year plan, which, as I mentioned last week, was sort of the prototype for an entire political and industrial institution in the Soviet Union. Now, the first 5-year plan is very complicated and there is a lot going on, but I think that I can sort of summarize what the first 5-year plan meant and what its costs and its effects were with one very famous story, sort of illustrating the big picture with the little picture, if that makes sense. And this story, the story in question, is a story of what's called the White Sea to Baltic Sea Canal. Construction on the White Sea Canal began in 1931, and it was intended to connect the industrial heartland of Russia, vis-a-vis the White Sea, to the Baltic Sea, and from there to the Atlantic Ocean trade routes, basically to connect Russian industry to wider markets in Europe and the rest of the world. In classic Stalinist and wider Soviet fashion, hundreds of thousands of slave laborers from the Gulag systems were put to work on the canal, which resulted in, unfortunately, numbers again vary, but anywhere from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of deaths. Unfortunately for everybody involved, the project would end up being rushed as part of the 5 and 4 movement that we talked about last week, which meant that, among other things, the canal is actually too shallow for any major commercial shipping. So, yes, after hundreds of thousands of laborers working for zero money and potentially hundreds of thousands of them dying, the project was essentially useless for its intended purpose. It still exists, and it's quite pretty. It's a cute little motorway for more residential and local boat traffic, but it never achieved what it was originally set out to achieve. And I think that very effectively illustrates the first 5-year plan broadly. There were wildly optimistic expectations, which then sort of collapsed into very disappointing results at the cost of a tremendous loss of life. But luckily, that is not the greatest consequence of the first 5-year plan. Unluckily, the arguably greatest consequence of the first 5-year plan was the massive Soviet famine that kicked off in 1932. Essentially, right as the first 5-year plan kicked off, a wave of collectivization spread through the agricultural heartland of the USSR, and this resulted in widespread peasant resistance. Many peasants would even resort to mass killings of their livestock and burning of their fields to keep them from falling into the hands of Soviet authorities. Also, the destruction and liquidation of the so-called kulaks, or the wealthy peasants that we mentioned last time, would seriously hurt food production, as they were often the most prosperous and the most successful. And of course, when all the successful peasants are being rounded up and enslaved, that does not exactly incentivize agricultural success for the rest of the population. As a result of all of this and the widespread and growing seizure of peasant food production led to a massive famine all across the Soviet Union. And it's probably fairly obvious, but just to enunciate this clearly, unlike almost all previous famines in Russian history, weather had almost nothing to do with the outbreak of this famine. It was almost entirely man-made. And this famine, which would be called most famously the Holodomor, or the Terror Famine in the Ukraine, took likely between 5 and 7 million lives, with about 4 million of them being in the Ukraine. Among the other places most hard hit from this famine was Kazakhstan, with about 2 million Kazakhs dying of starvation. And just as a sad and unfortunate aside for Kazakhstan, between this famine and the civil wars and the repression, this would result in the Kazakhs losing more than half of their population since the Bolsheviks came to power, making Kazakhs a minority in Kazakhstan. And the reason I mention Kazakhstan and the Ukraine specifically is because the severity of the famine is often noted by historians both then and now to be most intense in the areas that most resisted Soviet rule. Thus, this famine famine is often described as a deliberate act of genocide by the Soviet regime, and of course, Stalin more specifically. Granted, it is hard to know whether Stalin specifically intended the famine to take place in these areas, but it definitely seems very, very likely that he was, at the very least, quite ambivalent as to the effects of this famine. And the effects were horrible. As is obvious from the death toll, this was a catastrophic disaster that resonates with people all over the former Soviet Union to this day. In fact, as one researches the Stalin years and Soviet history more generally, this Holodomor comes up again and again and again. In fact, Khrushchev himself, the man who would succeed Stalin to power, tells many stories in his biography of families starving and of mothers having to decide which of their children is going to eat because they can't afford to keep all of their children alive. And there is even a story in Khrushchev's book about a woman who is forced to consume her own children in a desperate and, at that point, quite insane and unhinged attempt to stay alive. I know this story and these hideous tales are a bit of a change in tone from our usual weekly adventures, but I do want to make very clear that although this isn't talked about nearly as much as it should be, this famine and these years in the first 5-year plan were absolutely horrendous and a atrocious stain on Soviet history. Now, speaking of the man who really loved to put huge, horrible stains on Soviet history, at this point, at the end of the 5-year plan in 1932, Stalin was still not the all-powerful dictator he hoped to one day become, and who we most remember him as. Some of his policies, as is probably not surprising, were heavily contested, and even some of his appointments to high office were cancelled or vetoed. One man in particular who thus threatened Stalin's growing power was a man named Sergei Kirov. Kirov was a long-time crony of Stalin's. They were friends and murder bros for decades at this point. Kirov himself was a decorated and notably ruthless commander during the Civil War. He was also reportedly very corrupt, even for a Bolshevik. There's lots of stories and reports of him taking egregious bribes for the most simple of tasks. Despite, or frankly perhaps because of all this, he became quite popular in the higher echelons of Soviet power. In fact, he gained so much popularity and influence that he was able to outright refuse Stalin's commands several times. The most prominent example of Kirov's growing power and rivalry with Stalin took place during an election to the Central Soviet Committee in February of 1934. Kirov would handily and quite easily beat all the other candidates, including Stalin, though Stalin's other cronies would keep the results secret, so no one knew how badly Stalin had lost to Kirov. And likely as a direct result of this, in December of 1934, less than a year after that election, Kirov was shot and killed while leaving his office by a man named Leonid Nikolaev. And after this assassination, both Nikolaev and his wife would be tried and executed in secret, while almost all of Nikolaev's extended family were sent to labor camps. To no one's surprise, it has been reported, and seems highly likely, that Stalin ordered Kirov killed. Now, in light of this, it should be noted that aside from occasionally refusing Stalin's commands, which was not super uncommon for Soviet underlings to do, Kirov remained completely politically loyal to Stalin his entire life. He was actually quite famous for going on brash public denunciations of Stalin's enemies and for putting forth the idea that Stalin essentially embodied the Soviet Revolution. Unfortunately for Kirov, this loyalty to Stalin did not save him from Stalin, but this loyalty did give Stalin a golden opportunity. Because Kirov was so vocally opposed to Stalin's enemies, when Kirov was assassinated, probably by Stalin, almost all the remaining opponents of Stalin were rounded up and blamed for Kirov's murder. They were arrested, tortured, and in most cases executed. And this point in 1934 and into 1935, this is the start of Joseph Stalin's unchallenged, unquestioned control over the Soviet Union. He no longer has has anyone that will pose any threat to him. The Soviet Central Committee is basically now just a collection of Stalin's fanboys, and from this point forward, Stalin has complete control over everyone and everything in all of the Soviet Union. This is where the famous stories of Stalin's so-called cult of personality begin to emerge. This is where you get almost all households in the Soviet Union now having a enshrined portrait of Stalin, and this is where you get Stalin being shown in films leading the October Revolution alongside Lenin. And also, as a weird aside to all this, I can't find it again, but I remember reading somewhere that Stalin holds, to this day, the world record for building or ordering built the most statues of himself from anyone in history. So there's that as well. All that to say, Stalin is potentially a man who holds more power in his nation than any person has ever held in any nation. I cannot stress enough how much the Soviet Union almost was Stalin from here on out. But beyond statues and portraits and movies and all that other nonsense, the thing that really defines Stalin as a leader is the Great Purges. The huge wave of sweeping political repression, violence, and executions that would become known as the Great Purge was launched in 1937. Stalin essentially used the widespread fear and unease caused by the sensationalizing of Kirov's assassination to initiate repression on a arguably never-before-seen scale. And to help Stalin orchestrate this monstrous repression, he found a fanatically loyal man named Nikolai Yezhov. Nikolai Yezhov was a nasty, nasty fella. He got the job as the head of the NKVD secret police after conspiring and working with Stalin to orchestrate the downfall, torture, and execution of his predecessor. Yezhov, under Stalin's direct command and very close scrutiny, would oversee the monstrous crimes that would become the Great Purge. Essentially, this purge would manifest as a series of mass arrests and executions that would occur in 4 major phases. Phase 1 was the arrest and execution of all the prominent Soviet leaders that had been accused of involvement in the murder of Kirov. Phase 2 was a broader purging of elite party members who were either tied to or had previously been tied to victims of Phase 1. Phase 3 is where things really go off the rails. Targets are far more indiscriminate. Kulaks are, of course, targeted, but so are ethnic minorities, powerful military officers, outspoken peasants, and even family members of victims in Phase 1 and Phase 2. Phase 4 is the cleanup stage. This is the stage in which local agents and officers who had orchestrated or helped orchestrate the purge were blamed for the purge, arrested, and usually executed. Throughout this whole wild ordeal, evidence was negligible, to say the least, and most victims had no chance of a trial. Those who did get a trial were almost always tortured into confessing beforehand. The following trials would then be essentially show trials that were often aired on Soviet television, in which case people would say, "Oh yes, I am an enemy of the state and I plotted with fascists and whatever else to overthrow the government." And of course, if someone for some reason couldn't be tortured into confessing their crimes, they were almost always then told that their families would suffer if they didn't confess to what the government wanted them to confess. And if you think that evidence or guilt played any role in this, local NKVD leaders were often simply told a number, 6,000, 8,000, 10,000 of arrests and executions that the central leadership expected them to make. And of course, in classic Stalin fashion, if they failed to arrest and execute the expected number of people, they themselves would be arrested and killed. So yes, this is literally just death by the numbers. It has almost nothing to do with anything even distantly resembling evidence, guilt, or even meaningful targeting of this violence. Now, Yezhov, after orchestrating all this chaos and madness, soon realized what was in store for him. Realizing the hopelessness of his situation and knowing full well what was coming for him, he would devolve into alcoholism, isolation, and despair. And as we know quite well after studying Stalin for this long, Yezhov was right to despair. In February 1940, Nikolai Yezhov would be arrested on Stalin's orders and essentially blamed for the Great Purge. He would be brutally tortured and would then confess to all accusations against him. Despite insisting on his love and loyalty to Stalin, he would be shot in an NKVD, essentially murder basement, that he himself had personally designed, with a convenient sloping floor to an inbuilt drain to make cleaning blood easier. Unlike so many of Yezhov's victims, he would never receive any official clemency or forgiveness from either the later Soviet Union or modern Russia. Most victims of these purges would eventually be granted forgiveness or clemency and have their names reinstated into Soviet history, but Yezhov is still, to this day, considered a criminal and a villain by his country. And on that dismal note, we will have to conclude our episode for today. Next episode, we will continue the whimsical adventures of Stalin by jumping into the lead up and execution of the Second World War, or as it's known in the Soviet Union, the Great Patriotic War. I'll see you then.